Okay, welcome everybody to the first of many monthly webinars from Singh-Ray Filters. We are going to do these once a month. The first one with the Eclipse coming up was pretty obvious that that's what we wanted to talk about, and we're very excited to have Vinny Colucci as our guest presenter. To give you a little introduction to Vinny, he and his wife have been conducting photography workshops since 2003. Their goal, their philosophy is to just give you the best photographic adventure possible with high quality photography instruction. They do a lot of face-to-face trainings. Vinny's been all over this week talking about the Eclipse. So he's going to be eclipsed out by the end of the week. But their mission is to get you out there enjoying everything out there that God gave us to enjoy and photograph it so you can bring it home and share it with others. If your photograph makes your viewer want to go see for themselves, then your photograph did a good job, which is a great way to look at it. So Vinny, I'm not going to take up any more space. If you want to add to that introduction that I gave you at all, or if you just want to dive into the presentation, go ahead. By way of controls, there are a few places you guys can interact with us. I see I've got one person with their hand up. If you raise your hand, we can call on you and ask you a question, or let you ask your question. You can also answer a question in the Q&A window. I'm going to be watching that, and also the chat window. I'm going to watch both of those, and if I see any questions coming up, I'll read them aloud so that Vinny can focus on his part and he doesn't get lost in the technology. But also so that when you guys have questions, some of them we're going to save to the end, but at least this way, type them in so that you don't forget by the time we get to the end, and then we'll make sure every single question that's out there gets answered. We've got a couple of connection questions. Ritesh says she doesn't see anything and no audio either. So when you first come into the webinar window, she can't hear me, so I'm going to type this in too, but there should be a button that says join using my computer. So make sure that you click that. If you don't see anything, I would check for any windows that might be minimized. You should be seeing a slide that says photographing the sun, and it's got the Singh-Ray logo on there, the Escape to Nature logo. Let me answer her in text. Hear us. Okay. We've got a lot of questions filtering in already. Michael asked, how do you connect? If you can expand on that, connect to the webinar or connect to the photographer, you are connected because you're messaging me. So if anyone is still having issues seeing anything, send an email to me. Actually, send it to info@singray.com. It's SINGA-RAY.com. And then hopefully we can help you offline to figure out how to get you online. Okay, so Vinny, if you want to take it from here, go ahead and take over.
Thank you. Hi, folks. My name is Vinny Colucci with Escape to Nature Photography Workshops. I am proud and honored that you all signed up for this webinar, and I'm particularly honored that Singh-Ray Filters invited me to be the very first presenter. So hopefully I can do some justice for them, and more importantly for you. Thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful introduction. See what happens, guys, when you pay somebody $5, they talk nice about you. We're going to have some fun tonight. We're going to learn a little bit about using the Singh-Ray filters for the up-and-coming Eclipse. And just a little bit of housekeeping. You see on the page our website and my email. So if for some reason your question doesn't get answered, or you think about a question later on, feel free to email me and I will get back to you answering those questions. Our workshop programs are an open book. That means even if you've never taken, or even if you never do take a workshop with us, if you have a photography question, or particularly about this webinar, feel free to contact me at any time. We want to be a resource for you. And the last part of our little housekeeping is we do a monthly newsletter, and it only goes out once a month. But you have to either go to my website, go to the tab for newsletter and sign up, or send me an email and I'll send you an invitation. We do protect your email identity, and folks, if for some reason you don't like the newsletter after a few months or you're getting way too many emails, our unsubscribe actually works. So you don't have to be worried that you're going to be put on any list or your email is going to be shared with anybody. The only people that see it is myself and my wife, Annette. So that's it for that. So we're going to get to work, and hopefully by the end of this, you guys do have some questions. All right. Photographing the sun is exciting, and particularly photographing the eclipse is exciting. But we really need to make sure we have all of our equipment in order before we do it. And equipment for photographing a solar eclipse, or just the sun in general, is probably stuff we already own. You don't have to be an astronomer. You don't have to have a super duper telescope. A good telephoto lens, anywhere's between, I have written down here 400 to 600 millimeters, but I know folks that get some really good results at 300 millimeters. So the equipment we're already using for our normal photography will work just fine in most of the applications of photographing the eclipse. This is some of the setups that I'm going to be using and I've been practicing with. I do own a TeleVue 85 telescope, and I'm a Nikon shooter, so my main setup for this eclipse coming up is going to be my Nikon D500 with my 200 to 500 at 500 millimeters set on a tripod, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Because tripods in general are, for me, some of the most important equipment as photographers we could pick. And too many times we have too flimsy of a tripod. But particularly when you're doing something like telephoto work with something like the solar eclipse, you really need to have a really stable tripod. This is some of the equipment that I'll be using, and I do use. In my case, I'm using a heavy-duty Gitzo tripod. My main setup is going to be on a gimbal head, so I could easily maneuver a larger telephoto lens around and get it lined up with the sun as the eclipse is beginning, and through the finalization of the eclipse, or something like a really good ball head. These are the things that, as a wildlife and nature photographer, I use daily in my normal photography, but work very, very well in this up-and-coming eclipse. So equipment is very important, and we need to be able to pick what we want. Now, as far as our camera setup, this could vary just a little bit from person to person, and again, a lot of the nomenclature I'm using might lean towards Nikon nomenclature because that's what I do shoot, but a lot of it translates to, if you're a Canon shooter or Sony shooter or any of the other camera manufacturers out there, they all do an excellent job. For example, it comes up many times in our workshop, should I shoot RAW or JPEG? Pros shoot RAW. Now, you could shoot whatever you would like, but in this case, because we do really need to do some post-processing at the end of this, RAW is your better choice. Now, that doesn't mean you wouldn't get good results in JPEG, but I would recommend that you shoot in your native RAW for your camera. Sharpening, yes, we're going to talk about that just in a little bit. Sharpening, in your camera, as well as when you get it into your post-processing. And color space and back focus button, that question comes up a lot. Well, we're going to be presetting our autofocus. So whether you shoot with the shutter button or your back focus button, it really is not something that we're concerned ourselves with on this particular event. In-camera sharpening, a lot of people say, well, why worry about in-camera sharpening if you are going to do post-process sharpening? Well, a lot of times we take a look at our image, and obviously this isn't a eclipse image on the back of the camera, but we look at our image to see if we're sharp, and the in-camera sharpening, if you put it up towards its full amount, will give you an image in your monitor that'll be much closer to what you're going to see in when you finish with your image on your computer. So I do recommend doing in-camera sharpening. For whatever reason, my pointer went away. Let's backtrack that just a little bit. I thought I had a pointer working, and it doesn't seem to be working. I'm sorry. But in-camera color settings, our cameras come set to sRGB when we take them out of the box. And in sRGB, that means we have 256 tones of color we're recording in. I recommend you change that to Adobe 1998 RGB, and that means you're recording 64,000 tones of color. These settings are pertinent to me in any of our photography, not just for this Eclipse. So just some recommendations on setting your camera up as we get ready for this event or any of your photography events coming up. Autofocus settings, again, we're going to be in manual focus, and we'll talk about that throughout this, this webinar. And we're going to, for the manual focus, we're going to talk about how to set our lens to infinity. So we're not worried about autofocus at all for the up and coming Eclipse. So that means our shutter button, whether you use back focus button for autofocus or not, our shutter button is what we need to be able to activate when we're actually metering the sun for a proper eclipse exposure. And that's important, particularly before the eclipse starts. And I also recommend that we use either a shutter release cable or a wireless remote so that we're not holding on to the camera and introducing additional vibration, which might yield things like the sunspots that might be occurring to be soft. It's just like the eye of you know, wildlife. You want the eye sharp. We want any part of that sun that's distinct to be as sharp as possible. So I do recommend in this setup that that you use a cable release of some type. A couple of easy steps as we set our cameras up and getting ready for the eclipse. Focus on infinity, and we're going to show that in just a second. Depth of field, which is our aperture setting. Some people have emailed me already prior to this and asked me, well, should I shoot wide open? I shoot wide open when I do star photography. No, I actually recommend, and I'm going to be shooting, photographing the eclipse at f8 on my camera, but between f8 and f11. And the reason for that is our lens is sharpest somewhere around f8 to f11. Even if you have a 2.8 lens, like a 400 2.8, it's not at sharpness at 2.8. So I recommend being at f8 and f11. We're not worried about depth of field per se, but when we preset to infinity, if our lens marking is a little bit off, the little bit of depth of field we gain might pull that sharpness in a little bit tighter. So between f8 and f11, whatever you're comfortable with. And in this, I do recommend that you shoot in manual. And some of you might not be comfortable with that. And I recommend you get out and practice before the eclipse occurs. Some people like to shoot in aperture priority. And if you're just photographing the sun, that works really well. But when you have a moon that's starting to chase across the face of the sun, and you're in something like aperture priority, what happens is that the exposure starts to chase when you have the bright sun and the black moon coming in front. And choose your metering mode for what you're going to do. A lot of our cameras, most of us stay in something like matrix metering, and we'll talk about that in just a second, why you shouldn't do that for this particular event. So setting your lens for infinity, our lenses have markings in feet and in meters, and at the very end for the furthest distance there's an infinity mark. And a lot of us just, when we set our lens for infinity, just rack it all the way over to the end. But our autofocus lenses are a little different than years ago when we had manual focus lenses. So the infinity mark hasn't, goes past the infinity mark, and then your image is a little bit soft. So if you look at these two settings, you'll see that where the 2 arrows are pointed. This shows you 2 examples of where you could introduce a sharpness error. So do not just turn it all the way over to infinity, right to the end, and let it hit the end stop. This is not correct. You want to do something more like this. Find that infinity mark and center it dead center on your focal marking on your lens. And then you know your lens is set to infinity.
So we do have a relevant question, and I apologize to some of these questions we're going to hold to the end. This one looks relevant to what you're talking about now. Phil wants to know if my lens is sharpest at f8, does that still apply when using a 2x teleconverter and where it changes the lens from f2.4 to f5.6?
Actually, yes, it is relevant. My recommendation is that if you're going to use a 2x or 1.4 converter, a lot of people don't realize this, and most of us, I think, at this webinar are photographers doing some solar eclipse photographing instead of the other way around. When you add a converter, let's say you have an f2.8 lens and you put a 2x converter, you're going to lose 2 stops of light, so you're going to have a 5.6 converter. But your depth of field still is around 2.8, so that if you move your lens to f8, as far as depth of field, you're really not at f8. You're going to have to be up at f11 to get that f8, to get to that sharpest part of the lens. Now, keep in mind, if you're not using a matching converter, for example, if you're shooting Nikon, I'd use the Nikon converter. If you're shooting Canon, I'd use a Canon converter. If you're using a Sigma lens, I'd use a Sigma converter, so that the optics match, because converters have a tendency to degrade the optics a little bit. And some of the really high-end lenses, you know, the pro-level lenses, take it much better than some of the non-pro lenses. So you have to be careful about introducing softness when you add a converter. I'm personally not going to use a converter, even though I'm tempted to. I know my 200 to 500 can handle a converter okay, but I want to get the best sharpness I can around those sunspots. So that's just my personal choice. I would recommend that you go out before the eclipse on a nice sunny day and photograph the sun. And you'll see the edge of the sun and you'll see the sunspots. Photograph it with and without the converter. Photograph it at f8, photograph it at f11, and take a look at your results before. Many times in photography, we don't practice before we go to a location shoot, or in this case, an event shoot. So that's my recommendation on that. Picking our metering mode. Now, a lot of my photography work, I stay in the Nikon matrix metering system. For the Canon and Sony guys, they call that evaluated metering. But if you look, that means the camera is trying to, the computer and the camera is trying to help you with the exposure. My recommendation is to switch to spot metering. And spot metering disengages all that computer stuff in the camera and allows you to meter strictly on the sun. And we're going to talk about what exposure you should get in just a couple of slides, but disengaging the matrix or the evaluated metering, going to spot metering, all you want is an exposure of the sun itself. Even as the excuse me, as the moon starts to pass in front of the sun, as long as there's solar activity shown, you want that exposure to be about the sun. The moon is going to be a silhouette. It's going to be black. I typically never use center weight metering anymore, so I'm going to be in spot metering, metering off the sun. Now, if you are a Nikon shooter and you have some of the new equipment, the D5, the D500, and the new D7500, they have a new spot metering on there. It's a spot metering with an asterisk. That is, in fact, from what I understand, reading their manual doesn't really clearly tell you what this is about. But that spot metering with the asterisk is spot metering with a little bit of matrix metering help. I would stay away from that for photographing this eclipse. That's great when you're spot metering animals running through, you know, dynamic light or something like that, but I would just stay with normal spot metering for this event. exposure and white balance. This is not going to be a histogram lesson, but there's some points that we really need to keep in mind. I hope all of you use your histogram to sort of check where your exposure is, because we're not going to be able to really spend a lot of time with it, second guessing exposure in the field. The eclipse happens really quick. I think the maximum, depending on where you are in the country, if you're going to get a total eclipse, it's going to be in around the 3-minute range. Most of the rest of the country, it's going to be in the 2-minute range. That's not a lot of time, and you want to be able to get to the right exposure quickly. So understand that your histogram shows 5 stops, and the beauty of this is we're going to stay within those 5 stops. Digital cameras record between 6 and 8 stops, but that histogram still only shows that 5-stop range. So yes, you'll be relying on periodic checks at histogram through this entire event. And here's what we're going to be looking at. The histogram, for those that don't know, just a quick review. The center of the histogram is midtone, and then a histogram goes +1, +2, and the very end to the far right is at the +2 area is white with detail, and from center to the left is black with detail, which is -2 stops. So we need to pay attention to that, because when we start to deal with photographing the sun like this, you need to be about a stop, and that would be maximum, about a stop underexposed on your histogram. So when you spot meter the light of the sun and you check your histogram, and I do this before the eclipse starts, because once the eclipse starts, the sun isn't going to change its value unless we're dealing with a cloudy day. And we'll talk about that before the end of this program. But,
so Vinny?
Yes?
Ronald wants to know if he should bracket his exposure.
You could absolutely bracket your exposure, and if you have bracketing built into the camera where you could launch 3 exposures, I would bracket plus or minus about 0.7, and then fire off 3 shots, and then you'll know you have something to deal with. But on that very first shot, just take a shot of the sun before the eclipse starts. You really should be set up, a half hour, an hour before it's going to start. Anyway. And then try to get your exposure spot metering off the sun where it's about a stop underexposed, or 3/4 of a stop underexposed. Doesn't have to be an exact science, just thereabouts. And then put your bracketing in. And once you put your bracketing in, then you're going to cover any range that you might need. But yeah, 3/4 of a stop to a stop under will pull in enough of the detail of the sun, so when we get to post-processing, we'll get a good looking photograph as the eclipse is occurring. And later, when we get to post-processing and get this nice orange look, it still needs to be somewhere around a stop under, or 3/4 of a stop under. Otherwise, you're not going to get, and again, this is going to be personal preference, and we're going to do this live. We're actually going to post-process one image at the end of this so that you can see how this all comes into play. But that's similar to the histogram you're going to get. Notice to the far right, you get this big spike in the black area. In fact, it's in the very dark to black area. That is really the rest of the space. We don't care what's happening there. That's the black around the sun. Even going back to this one, if you look at it, that's the black around the sun to the far left. On the right, up by the the +1 area, that's the sun itself. So we need to be tuned in to the exposure of the sun, not what's happening with the space around the sun. And we have to be careful not to overexpose. It's really easy when you're photographing the sun, even through 20 stops or 15 stops of Mor-Slo filters, to be overexposed, and you get this blooming effect. And if you just look at the monitor behind your camera, if you pull one up, it might even look cool to you. But really, there's no detail in the center of that sun. And if you look at the spike to the far right of the histogram that I'm showing, that's just a spike right up the wall where I'm losing detail in the sun itself. So we don't want to see that. We want to see, something that's more like this. So keep that in mind. And again, I'm going to encourage you through this whole thing to go out and practice. Right now, we got a perfect subject. We have the sun, and it's there every day. So find some time on a clear day and go out and do this.
And Vinny, when do
yeah.
you start? When do you start bracketing?
When do you start bracketing?
Yep.
I'm not sure what the question is. When do you start bracketing? I would come back here. I would take a single shot, unbracketed, and try to adjust your exposure so that you get this type of histogram. Then I would bracket plus or minus 0.7. So I know in the Nikon system, I could bracket up to 9 exposures, but I would pick 3, and I would bracket, I would put 0.7 in there. So it would take a normal shot, which would be this shot, and then it would take one at plus 0.7 and one at minus 0.7. So you'd end up with 3 shots for every image. And again, I'm not familiar with every manufacturer, but with the Nikon system, if I put in 2 bracketed stops, so I'm taking 3 shots, I hold the shutter down, it'll take 3 images and stop. So then I know I could shoot again. And then once the bracketing is set, you could do that through the entire Eclipse. You don't have to worry about changing the bracketing at all. Does that make sense to that person?
Yes, and I see a few more questions coming through. In the interest of time, I'm going to hold them all to the end and let you, Vinny, get through the rest of these slides and jump into the other things that you wanted to show us.
Okay. When we do get, if those of us are lucky enough to be in the total eclipse path, we need, the exposure is a little bit different for the total eclipse than when we're showing a partial eclipse. So when we have the total eclipse, and we'll talk about this again before the end of this program, you actually will remove your filters for just the total. I recommend that you're a tad underexposed, that you're not right up against the wall. But you see where the arrow is showing in the histogram, that spike? That spike is the bright light of the sun. And the rest of it building up into the blackness is just that scattered light when you're at full eclipse. And the only time you would ever remove your filter is if you have a total eclipse. If you're in an area where you're only getting 98% or 97%, your filter set's going to stay on for the entire eclipse, because one of the things we want to make sure is that nobody injures their eye in this. We're dealing with the sun here, and if anybody is an astronomer, which I play with astronomy, but I'm a photographer. We have to be very careful not to damage ourselves. But controlling our histogram for exposure, if you do still decide you're going to stay in a program mode like aperture priority, you could do it with your exposure compensation dial. But again, I really recommend, and the right way to do this is in the manual mode. And since we're going to pick F8 or F11, someplace in there, you'd be changing your shutter speed in this case to adjust your exposure, to make sure that your histogram is following suit. We also have to be a little concerned with white balance. We're looking at white suns as we get these images through neutral density filters such as the Mor-Slo. And later on in post-processing, we'll bring back the orange. But I try to help that a little bit. All of us have played with histograms, and not histograms, I'm sorry, with white balance in our camera. There's presets, cloudy, there's shady, there's sunny, there's a flash setting if you're shooting flash indoors, but there's also something called the K scale or the Kelvin scale. I recommend you go into the Kelvin scale, which most of them are set from about 2500 K, which is fairly cool, all the way up to 10,000 Kelvin, which is very warm. I recommend that you push your Kelvin scale up to 10,000. That starts to collect, even if you don't see it, some warmth that will help the post-processing later. I would not put your camera in auto white balance, because it's going to try to make everything look like the Japanese engineer that designed your camera in Japan wanted it to look like. So I recommend you go into the Kelvin scale, which is usually designated by a K, and then you could dial in from typically 2,500 all the way up to 10,000. I would put it on 10,000. And since that's not a normal white balance setting for most people, it doesn't matter if you bring it back. In fact, it probably out of the box, it's set at 5,000. And then remember, at the end of the eclipse, you put your white balance back to your normal shooting style. Otherwise, you're going to have really weird pictures the rest of the week. So this is just for during the eclipse. Kelvin scale to 10,000. I've been experimenting and using the Mor-Slo 15 and 5-stop filter combination to get my 20 stops. Singh-Ray is making some special 20-stop Mor-Slos for those that want a 20-stop Mor-Slo. And I don't know if they have them in all the ring sizes or not. You'll have to check with Singh-Ray filter. I like having a separate 15-stop and 5-stop where I stack them. And the reason for that is because I could use them for other photography events, and those 15 stops and 5 stops are very handy for things like moving water and motion control in streams and waterfalls and so forth. So my recommendation is to get a 15 stop and a 5 stop, but they do make 20 stop Mor-Slos too. Again, not for every ring size, so check with them and see if they make one for your particular lens size. But yes, you could use these for photographing the solar eclipse, but we have to be very careful not to damage our eyes when we're doing that. So again, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Singh-Ray makes 2 different types. They make the circular one, which screws on the front of your lens. You need to know your lens size, such as 77mm, and it screws on the front. And then they make a rectangular or a square one. I use the 15 and the 5 rectangular, actually mine is square, Mor-Slo filters. And I've also do have a 20 stop that I play with. I just like stacking the 15 and 5 because it gives me some flexibility later on. And if you look and I like the rectangular ones, I use a filter holder, and I do that for 2 reasons. Remember I mentioned that at the full total eclipse, you have to remove your filters for that 1.5 to 3 minutes that total eclipse is going to happen. This filter holder snaps off. So even on a telescope, I could easily remove the filter holder until the total eclipse starts to re-engage and the moon starts to move, then I could quickly put it back on. If I used a screw-on filter, I'd have to mess around with unscrewing the filter, which is okay, but I need to also be careful not to move my infinity point on my autofocus on my lens, or in this case, a telescope. So again, I like to use a filter holder and stack it. Now, if you notice, if anybody's owned a Mor-Slo filter, there's actually a gasket on it to really shut out the light. So the first filter, I have 2 in here. I have a 15 stop and a 20 stop. The first one that's up close to my lens, the gasket is up against the lens so I could seal out external light. But the problem is you can't stack 2 Mor-Slos on top of each other in a filter holder with the gasket is too thick. So I reversed that outside one. So the gasket is pointed outward so it fits in my holder. That's the only reason that you see it reversed. So it looks something like this. See, I just slide it in and reversed in front of the first Mor-Slo, and it gives me the 20 stops that I like in doing this. Singh-Ray, for those that still want a circular, they do make the 15 stop and a 5 stop and circular. You could stack those and screw those together. Or you could buy a 20 stop, I certainly up to 77mm. I'm not quite sure how big they make a ringed filter. But the rectangular one, that's a 95mm lens that's on. And again, they do make a 15 stop 95mm one because that's what's on the lower photograph. Aperture, we talked a little bit about that. I would try to be in the f8 to f11 range on the native lens because that's the sharpest part of that lens. We have plenty of ISO and we have plenty of light. You're not going to deal with anything brighter than the sun. So if you had to go to f16 with your teleconverter on it, to get the native f8 to f11, that's fine. I'm going to shoot at higher ISOs. A lot of my colleagues said, oh, no, shoot at ISO 100 or 200. But I'm going to be up a little higher than that. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So safety first. ND type filters are not dedicated solar filters, so I'm going to say prolonged viewing through them could cause damage to your eyes. The advantage of doing something like an ND style filter, though, is that you could use it for other photographic work. That's why I like the Singh-Ray. Singh-Ray produces the best filters in the world. You know, I knew Bob Singh, you know, very well. Excellent physicist. You know, these filters are designed to be the best you could get, and they do have UV protection. But with any of these type of filters, I do not recommend prolonged or even at all any viewing directly through your lens. I really recommend that you use live view when using these type of filters. So, and we have an error here. I don't know why it happened, but that little slide of the sun was supposed to be over the monitor. So I'm not going to fix that right now and slow us down. But live view images, well, maybe I can. Michelle, I'm just going to fix this real quick. I hope people don't mind, because I don't like the way it looks. And then we'll go back. At least it'll be closer to what I wanted to show. There we go. So if you get a live view image behind your camera, you don't have to worry about UV or radiation hurting your eyes. And if you use the settings we talked about, you pre-focus, you don't have to worry about autofocus at all. You just need to know that your metering that you can see right on top of your camera. You call up the metering and look on the top screen of your camera. Do
you have to worry about the Mor-Slo filter protecting or not protecting the sensor on your camera?
We were going to actually get to that in just a second. Okay. And so save that question.
Okay.
All right. But let's just keep the right now I'm focused on the eyes, but you will get sharp images set on infinity and using your external, not looking through the viewfinder, using your external meter. Now, the Nikon system, this particular camera, I could close the viewfinder off with the flip of a switch. If you don't have that capability, put a piece of black tape over your viewfinder so you're not tempted to look through it and you're not getting external light from the back coming into your into your pen and prism. So I recommend closing off the viewfinder at that point. But talking about what you're talking about, I have checked with multiple camera technical people, and they all have said in live view, with the filters on, you should not damage the sensor. Now, I've personally been doing this since June, running live view on the camera with the Mor-Slo 15 by itself and the 15 plus the 5-stop, and I have not had any problems with my camera. But I have to tell you, I don't have any technical data, or anything in writing from any of the camera companies that will say, I guarantee. Nobody really knows, and that's a fact. But I could tell you that with long exposures, multiple hours of me shooting the sun in live view, I have not damaged any of my sensors. That's the only statement I can make to this. This points out that during the total eclipse, you do have to remove your filter. And I do use the live view to keep my eyes safe. Never point the camera at the sun without the filters in place, except during the total eclipse, because then you will damage your sensor even in live view. The filters have to be in place, or you can damage your sensor. Here's my setting. I am starting out at ISO 400. I like my shutter speed high. Why? It's not because the sun's moving fast. It's because even with a cable release, you're pretty high magnification. I worry about tripod vibration shape. So I want to minimize that. I want my shutter speed up a little bit higher than a landscape shot so that I can minimize camera shake even on a tripod. So I set my white balance to 10,000K. I set it to live view, and I use my Mor-Slo 15 stop and 5 stops stacked in front of my lens.
So we've had multiple questions now about whether a 15 stop is sufficient or even a 10 stop, or does it have to be 20 stops?
No, actually, I've gotten great results from 15 to 20 stops. It's a little easier to tame really bright light using 20 stops. It's just when you actually do your exposure and you're metering and you're dialing down your shutter speed, dialing it up and down to get the exposure. I found it was a little easier with 20 stops. 15 stops, quite adequate. I personally wouldn't go below 15 stops, because now you're starting to get down to the range where I worry about my sensor. This isn't because you wouldn't get a good photograph. And I've had colleagues that are astronomers say, oh, I'm using a 10 stop neutral density filter, I'm getting good results with the sun. Oh, that's fine. But when I talk to those technical people at multiple camera manufacturers, they all said they wouldn't recommend going below 15 stops, only because they don't know what's going to happen in live view to the sensor.
Right.
Because they don't know.
Shameless plug for Singh-Ray. We do have the Mor-Slo filters on sale with a promo code right now. So if you did want to add 5 or 10 stops to what you have already, on the Singh-Ray website, it's just sing-ray.com. There's a pop-up and it gives you the promo code. There's a smaller discount if you purchase a single filter, and there's a larger discount if you purchase multiples or if you purchase the 20 stop. And we do have them in stock, and if you order it now, you will get it in time for the Eclipse. So like I said, shameless plug, they're on sale. You'll save some money and you will get them on time. But I wouldn't recommend waiting too long, because we at some point probably will either run out of stock or we'll just run out of time to get it to you.
Hey, let me tell you something, guys. We're really lucky. Because if you need to stack, if you own a 10 stop Mor-Slo and you want to add, you could add another 10 stop to it, or add a 5 stop to it to get to 15s. We're working with high telephoto lenses here. We don't have to worry about vignetting. We could stack 2 or 3 filters and get great results. And one of the things I'm really careful with, and guys, I don't work for Singh-Ray. I'm a photographer. I'm a workshop leader. The optical quality in the Singh-Ray filters would allow me to stack. I've stacked up to 3, and I don't get internal reflections I get. With some of the cheaper filters out, I will not put an inexpensive filter in front of my lens. You take a $3,000 lens or $2,000 lens, you put an inexpensive filter in front of it, you might as well have bought a $400 lens. That's just my personal opinion from experience, and just because we didn't cover it in housekeeping. Prior to me being a professional photographer, my background was in engineering and physics. So take it for what it's worth. I'm not going to destroy my lens by putting cheap filters in front. And that's one of the reasons I went to Singh-Ray. So that's a Singh-Ray plug, but from somebody that's not getting paid to say it. So we'll go on to the next slide. So again, once you get the correct exposure, if we're really lucky and where you are, it's not cloudy out and we have a clear day, that exposure is going to hold true through the entire eclipse for the sun. It doesn't change. But we have to be a little bit careful. You see, like this image here, it was a little hazy out and there was some thin cloud cover, and that might change the exposure. So as we're photographing that half hour, 45 minutes into, prior to the eclipse and then afterwards as the moon's moving in front, I would check the exposure to make sure you don't have to adjust it a little bit. You're going to have plenty of time for the partial eclipse. It's only the 2 or 3 minutes for the total eclipse that you're going to be a little bit rushed. So again, keep an eye on that histogram, not the metering, but on the histogram, and if you need to go up or down, whatever it takes to get a histogram that looks similar to this. This is an actual histogram. Well, it's a levels histogram of the sun, so you'll get something very similar to what I'm showing. And again, if you are lucky enough to be in a path of the total eclipse, only remove your filter during the total eclipse. You're probably going to have to increase from that -1 stop to about -0.3 stops, but that's going to vary. It's not an exact science. You're going to have to look at the histogram and make an adjustment. Check your histogram. Once you have it and it looks halfway decent, then take as many images as you can before that total eclipse starts to move again. As soon as the total is over, even 1% movement, get those filters back on, so that you don't damage your eye and you don't damage your sensors. And then reset your exposure settings back to what you did before the total happened. It's just going to be the moon will be on the other side of the sun as it opens back up again, but the exposure for the sun should be exactly the same. Pretty easy stuff once you get out and practice. Once we photograph the sun, we're not going to get that really nice orange ball that we all want. This is what you're going to get through a Singh-Ray Mor-Slo filter. You're going to get any sunspots that are occurring, the moon moving in front, you'll get that. But you're going to have to go into some type of post-processing work. So to get from that top left one to the bottom left one, I don't know what software everybody's using, but I'm going to go through a quick demonstration in Lightroom, and you can mimic this, or you could email me questions and I'll be glad to help you.
So Vinny?
Yes.
I'm gonna change things a little bit in the interest of time, because we're 50 minutes into it, and I know at least one person said they have to go. Okay. So what I want to do real quick, I don't want you to not share the information, but I want to let everybody on here know it is being recorded, and if you're logged in right now, that means that you're on our list and you will automatically get a copy of the recording. It should arrive in your inbox tomorrow. So if you need to leave the end of the webinar, you can come back and watch the rest of it tomorrow. We hope that you'll stay because these questions are awesome. And then while we're kind of taking a break right here, I've got a lot of questions, Vinny, that are still on the camera side. So let's get these answered, and then we'll jump into Lightroom.
Okay. And this is actually the end, so we could go back and back and forth in the slideshow and answer any questions you want, and then we'll go live in Lightroom. And we only need a few minutes. We're going to do one image in Lightroom, and then everybody should be able to.
Yeah, we have a lot of really good questions, and I thank you guys all for asking these questions, because if you have the question, there are probably 5 other people that do and didn't bother asking, or were afraid to ask. So I'm going to go through some of these, Vinny. Let's see. I want to know if I should plan to use a wide angle or zoom lens. I will be in the Chattanooga, Tennessee area, and I expect the sun to be high in the sky.
You will be high in the sky in Chattanooga. You'll get a total eclipse there. You're in a great position. If you're using a telephoto lens to get the images that you're doing, that I was showing today, as far as that size on your sensor, that's one thing. Going to a wider angle lens and getting, you're going to be high in the sky, so it's unlikely you'll get a landscape in the background, even with the high mountains in Chattanooga. But the wider angle lens, what I'm going to do, and again, we don't, in the interest of time, we don't have it here, but if you have multiple exposure in your camera, like I'm setting one of my cameras up with a 70 to 200, and just at 150 to 200 millimeters, I'm gonna fire that camera with a wireless remote while I'm working with my main camera and get multiple shots of the eclipse occurring, and then hopefully have time to pull those filter sets off so I could get that center shot, and then multiple shots. You know, so I'm gonna do 10 multiple exposures on one wide angle shot. You don't have to do that, but you could certainly do that, or you could just take wider angle shots. If someplace in Chattanooga you could catch a piece of a mountainscape, again, I doubt it because it's going to be so high in the sky. Yeah, you could certainly do that, but you have to expose for the sun, not the foreground or if you catch any background. It's got to be for the sun, or you're just going to have a big white dot that you can't do anything with in post-processing.
Okay, and obviously we recommend Singh-Ray filters because we think they're the best, but do you have a question here about a Lee filter, and I would love to answer it. Most importantly, we want to make sure everybody gets what they need from the webinar. Jeff wants to know, can I safely photograph the sun with a combination of a Lee Big Stopper ND 10 stops, and a Lee little stopper ND, which is 6 stops.
Absolutely. That would absolutely work. Same rules apply because those filters aren't dedicated solar filters. I would recommend you use LiveView. And all the formulations that I showed you today work exactly the same.
Okay. And can you use a number 10 ND, and can you stack a variable 1 to 10 ND filters?
Yes, you can. But if you have a variable one, just be a little careful. You shouldn't than that because we're using a telephoto lens. The person that was using the wider angle lens, you got to be a little bit more careful about stacking more than 2 filters where you start to pick up the edge of the filter. But yes, you can stack a variable. Just make sure you don't, some variables go down, under 5 stops. Be careful you don't accidentally turn it down where you're not at least 15 stops to protect that sensor. Or for those that take the chance and take a glimpse through their viewfinder, and I don't recommend that, that you are at least 15 stops total to do this. And if you're up over 20 and 25 stops, because you have a 6 stop plus a 10, that's not going to hurt anything, as long as you get the exposure right. And you could do that by checking your histogram.
Okay, and then is there a benefit to using a polarizer in conjunction with a Mor-Slo or solar filter during a partial eclipse? And how about the use of a polarizer during totality when the Mor-Slo or solar filter is removed?
Well, you're going to be facing the light directly. So a polarizer, even in a normal backlit, here's my photography teaching for the day. I use a polarizer on every lens. Well, that's what I do for wildlife and nature. I like to polarize, even if it's backlit, if I'm front lit, if I'm side lit. We all know that polarizers are most effective when the sun is coming in at 90 degrees. So my answer is, I don't think it's going to help you in this case to have it on there. I don't think you're even going to have the time to see if you have a little contrast change. So to mess around with taking off the Mor-Slo filters and then trying to get a polarizer on there, I think you have more of a chance of bumping your scope and having trouble resetting it up than you do any benefit from the polarizer in this case. So I would say no.
And 2 different people asked, if I am shooting raw, does it matter to set up the white balance?
No, you could, obviously you could pull things over in software. Even in RAW, a lot of people don't realize this. When you pull things into Lightroom and you're shooting in RAW, a lot of the things in your camera that are set go a little mute because you're shooting in RAW. But one of the things that does translate over is white balance. So I still like to push that white balance up for this to 10,000 Kelvin. I have found, you're not going to see much of a result, but I have found that it gave me better results when I did post-process. And when I post-process, when I get to that, I'm going to show you that I actually take my white balance in post-processing and pull that all the way over to the right before I start pulling the color back in. So I'm just trying to get every bit of information as I can. So it's certainly not going to hurt you to be in.
And a couple of guys wanted to know if you could suggest a shutter speed.
Well, you know what? I'm going to try to get my shutter speed to 1/500th of a second or higher. And here's why. Even in wildlife, I try to get my students, especially when birds in flight. I keep getting blurry images. Yeah, you're shooting at 1/125th of a second. I'm worried about vibration of even on a tripod. Getting your shutter speed up over 1/500th of a second will minimize the chance. Look at that. Look at the close-up through my telescope of the sun to the lower right on this slide. That sunspot and the edge of the sun is sharp. I tried to shoot that originally at about 1/250th of a second. I had a lower ISO, and the edge was soft, and that sunspot was softer. So I upped my ISO until I was someplace over 1/500th of a second. I think that shutter speed on that shot was about 1/600th or 1/800th of a second, and I got a sharp image. So my suggestion is whatever it takes in ISO to get your shutter speed up over 1/500th of a second.
And then someone else just purchased the 15 stop from Singh-Ray, and she wants to know if it would make sense to replace it for the 20 stop, or is she going to get more use probably out of the 15 stop long term, right?
Well, here's the problem. If you bought the 20 stop, you probably will have limited use of it for your other photography. So the 15 stop is much better. If you had the extra money and you added a 5 stop to that, that's also an excellent filter by itself for doing like moving water in a stream, and you don't want it to be quite as slow as the 15 stop. So as an investment, if you could only do one, do the 15 stop, you'll get terrific solar eclipse images. If you have the extra money, get another 5 stop, and then you also then have 2 different tools for your later on photography. So if you had to buy one, I would certainly buy the 15 stop. If you buy a 20 stop just for this, you'll have limited use for it later on compared to the 15 stop.
And a sort of related question. I don't want to buy a 20 stop for my 2 to 500 millimeter Nikon and never use it again. Most of my other lenses are 77 millimeter, and what do you suggest I do?
Okay. Which lenses are you using for the Nikon? Again, if you have a telephoto lens like Nikon's 80 to 400 in 77 millimeter, or even a 70 to 200 with a 2x converter, then get a 77 millimeter size. But if you're going to use something like Nikon's 200 to 500, which is a 95 millimeter, then I would recommend you use a filter holder similar to what I was showing. And by the way, Singh-Ray doesn't make filter holders, but I believe they sell some filter holders that would do just what I was showing.
Yeah. So the square filters then you could use on different size lenses.
Right. So then you just get a ring for the lens size that you have and use the filter holder. Almost all of my external filters, whether they're ND grads or whether they're ND filters or Mor-Slo filters, I really like the rectangular or square filter, so I could use a filter holder, and I have a ring for each of my different lens sizes, and it's the same holder.
And Dale wants to know, does the filter come off for the diamond ring and Bailey beads, and do you change your exposure?
Repeat that question, please.
Does the filter come off for the diamond ring and Bailey beads, and do you change the exposure?
Yes. I take the filter off as soon as the total eclipse happens, and you're getting that rim lighting like in that lower left-hand photo. And I have increased my exposure by about a 1/2 to 3/4 of a stop from what I was photographing before. And then when the moon moves, I'm starting to get a percentage of the sun back again. So it's not just that diamond starburst that you see there, and then I immediately put the filters back on.
Okay. Then Jeff says.
Oh, and then when I put the filters back on, I reduce the exposure back to the original setting for the partial eclipse.
Okay, and then she said, thank you for the response on the 15 stop. I omitted to mention that I purchased a circular 15 stop from Singh-Ray. Will it make sense to purchase an additional 5 stop? Will this not create a wider bokeh? That,
if she got a 5 stop that's screwed on, as long as she has a threaded filter, it should work fine. And it shouldn't hurt her, depending on her telephoto size. If she's shooting 150 millimeters, you might start picking up the edge of that filter. But if you're out past 200 or 300 millimeters, you should be fine stacking those 2 filters.
And Alan Johnson said, I hope I can get the 15 stop in time. And we know that we do have stock on the popular sizes for sure, but definitely order sooner rather than later to make sure that that's still the case when you place your order.
Yes, Singh-Ray, I know, is working around the clock to fill these orders. Yeah, so I really think they're going to be able to meet the demands if you get your order in soon enough. Like, order tomorrow morning. They would love to hear that. And I'm hoping some of the Singh-Ray folks are actually on this webinar listening to this.
And then Alan,
they're going to do everything they can to accommodate you.
Yeah, they're busy little hamsters this week.
Oh, yeah.
Alan wants to know, he purchased the universal solar filter that you wrap around the lens because he didn't think that he could use a Singh-Ray filter. Is he going to lose image quality?
The dedicated solar filter that wraps around the lens is the nice thing about it is everything I told you today applies to that. The other thing about that is you can look through that filter safely. Assuming it meets the NASA and ISO standards. The disadvantage of that filter is after you're done, other than taking pictures of the sun in the future, you can't use that filter to anybody else. There's some really good ones out there, and there's some that don't have great optical quality. So I don't know which filter you have. I would suggest you go out and practice before, and if it looks good on your computer, then it's good. You know, if you can't get a sharp image, then, you know, reconsider your filter selection before the eclipse occurs.
Oh, and I got a text message from the team, the busy guys in the office, and it said I should mention that they custom make the filters as orders are received. So what they have in stock are the supplies to make the filters, but they are assembled and made when you order them, and they are tested on the spot. Every single one of them is tested to make sure that there is zero imperfections. It's a very hands-on process, and they put a lot of love and care into it, and they wanted to make sure that you knew that.
Yeah, they're one of the only companies in the world, not just for photographers, but that actually hand make all their filters.
Yeah, and Alan wants to know, can Amazon get it to you faster? If Amazon has stock or somebody on Amazon has stock, possibly, chances are it's going to be going through a reseller who's probably going to get it from us anyway. So I would recommend, if you're in a time crunch, place your order online and then give us a call and let us know what you ordered and when you need it and where you need it delivered, and we will try to accommodate as best we can. We're real people and we like to help.
Just Alan, you're probably listening.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're going to get an influx of orders from this, but I've never ever had a problem getting filters in a timely fashion, or any of my workshop people have never gotten in a jam where Singh-Ray hasn't been honest about when they're going to get the filter. And so if they, you know, when you place your order, if they're telling you you're going to get it next week or in 3 days, you'll get it when they say. They're not going to muddy it up just to get an order. They'll let you know the truth.
And I had 2 people ask, do you recommend using a sky tracker for photographing the eclipse?
You don't need it. You really don't need it, because you're dealing with such bright light. It's just a single exposure. Sky tracker, you know, isn't really going to help. You know, if you were doing time exposure photography of stars or planets, that's where Sky Tracker really helps.
Okay, and here's a good question. I plan to shoot time interval images. I also plan to incorporate some of the landscape in the images. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yep,
I do. If you're using interval, which is what I'm going to do when I mentioned before, I'm going to take a wider angle shot. I'm doing it to do multiple exposures, so that every 20 minutes it takes a shot, and I could leave that setup unattended. But if you're going to have any landscape in it, if you're in a position out west someplace where you could get something in it, that's really great. Just make sure your exposure is for the sun. Even if you're silhouetting cactus or mountains, And then at the end of it all, if you want to take a separate exposure for that same landscape, you know, after the eclipse is over, and then use something like HDR software to glue them all together, that's up to you how creative and software you want to be. But I would, during the eclipse, the partial to the full, to the partial to the end, make sure you're exposed for the sun, because you just don't want a white blob with no detail in this. It's not the point of the eclipse.
Right.
That's just my recommendation. And listen, I'm not trying to make, you know, I know we have a lot of people signed up for this. I'm not trying to make 300 to 500 Vinny Colucci's out there. I'm just telling you what I've done to prepare for it, what I've done in the past, and what I'm doing when the eclipse comes. And, you know, I'm confident in my settings.
Yeah. And then I've got a couple of questions here. In the interest of time, we can answer these offline as well. There's a couple of people that want to know how to attach a specific filter to a specific lens. And I am skipping those for now, just because we have a lot of people on the line. And so I'm trying to find the questions that are the most broad. And then, of course, if we don't have time to answer all these questions online, we have your information and we can send you an email afterwards.
Michelle, do you want me to just go through that post-processing? It's like 6 minutes worth of post-processing.
Why don't you do that, and then I'll kind of
and then I'll keep answering questions after I do it. So yeah. let's do this. And again, there's my email if anybody wants to copy it down, either for signing up for our newsletter or to continue to send me questions. I will get to you long before the eclipse, I promise. And let's see if we can get Lightroom to open up and not do anything funky for what we're doing here. Of course, I actually didn't want Photoshop. I wanted Lightroom. There we go. All right. Post-processing is really, really simple to get some color back to the eclipse, because ideally what we want to go from that to something like that. Well, let's change to a small one. This, that, you know, to something that's nice and orangey. So what we're going to do is show you the steps to get this white sun with detail to something similar to this. So we're going to go over to Develop Tools. And here's our subject that we're working on. And remember I said that we want to be 3/4 of a stop to a stop underexposed. Once we get it in there, you know, you might have been off a little bit, and if it's a little too bright, you start to lose detail. So I actually go in and adjust the exposure, and to my liking, just make sure I'm seeing detail to maybe, you know, 3/4 of a stop, something like that. I also take my temperature, which is white balance, and I push it all the way up. You're not going to see much of a change, but it helps in later processing. And even though we're not blowing any highlights out, I like to just pull that highlight indicator down a little bit. It might preserve something on the edge that I can't see. And this clarity tool is a contrast popper. And I learned this little trick from a friend of mine. A lot of you probably heard of him, Scott Kelby. He's a Photoshop Lightroom guru. And the trick to this, for this type of stuff, is not to push it way up, you know, because it really pops the contrast till it's fake. But don't go past 20. I like my clarity tool set anywhere between, you know, 14 and 20, and I usually pick somewhere around 15, 16. And then forget about that. Now we want to bring back the color. So in our Lightroom panel, we have something called color, which it'll typically look like this, and you got to turn it on. And again, this really works in RAW. It doesn't work if there's a JPEG pulled in there. And then really we're adjusting things like, you notice that our saturation's down to 0. So I pull in some saturation to start to get some color back, and I pull in some hue to add some color. And I do that in the orange channel first. And I also do that in the red channel just a little bit. And I tone down the hue and try to get it to where I might like it, you know. So it's a matter of, there we go, playing with some of these controls to get that orange look that we're all used to. And then I also come over here, and you see now we're looking at the red, green, blue channels. I still like to make sure, we're going to go back up to exposure, that I pull that red channel so it's a little bit underexposed. Now, it doesn't have to be all the way down to one stop, but, and again, I go back and forth just a little bit and get something that looks nice. Now, this is Vinny Colucci's method. Now, I'm certainly not a Lightroom guru or a Photoshop guru. I'm a photographer. I do like taking an image like this, and I do like, I come over here to edit in, reopening it in Photoshop. This is just what I like to do when I'm taking a raw image and I've adjusted it. And this, by the way, I do to virtually all my images. So we're opening this image up in Photoshop. I like to come in here and go to Image, Adjust, Levels. And this is where I get my contrast back in any of my images. When I am shooting in RAW, I just bring a little contrast back. You don't see much of a change, but it pops it. You saw that pop. And that's it. And then with all of my image, it could be a grizzly bear, I use a little bit of sharpening. You know why? Because every digital image needs to be sharpened. And then I resave it in whatever format I need. In this case, it's probably set, yeah, to PSD, which is Photoshop file. And if we go down here, we go back to Lightroom, there it is. Here's the original right there, which is still raw, and here's the Photoshop version. And there's not much difference. It's just a finished product. That's my post-processing. And everybody will have this webinar so they can follow that. And even try, with the exception of the color change, you can try some of that post-processing technique on your normal images. But you end up with a really pretty image of the sun. And now, if this was the eclipse happening, all you would have is, you know, partial of the silhouette of the moon coming across. But our orange will look just like this. And we're not really affecting any of the black space or the silhouette of the moon as the moon does come across it. That's it, guys. It's not rocket science. But I believe in controlling light. And I use filters a lot in my photography, not just for the eclipse. I use neutral density filters and graduated neutral density filters and polarizers to control my light so I can minimize how much post-processing I have to do. So I hope that's helped everybody. And if anybody has any questions, I'm going to hide Lightroom.
Yeah, we still have 34 questions and more coming in. So
Okay.
we'll keep it right.
This, I will put this back up in case the questions are geared towards this. And go ahead, I'm here.
All right, so again, all of this is being recorded all the way from the very beginning to the very end. A couple of people had said, thank you very much. This webinar really helps, and we appreciate those comments too. That feedback is really helpful for Vinny and for Singh-Ray. And then also, specifically to Alan, we can ship the filter to your destination. You may need to request overnight shipping. So get in touch with the guys at the office. Alan, I sent you my cell phone number privately since it's after hours in Florida. And so if I can help connect you, I just don't want to give away someone else's cell phone. So give me a call and I'll try to put you in touch with them if it's super, super crucial timing-wise. And then another question about tracking the sun. Someone asked about a sky tracker, and two other people want to know, how are you tracking the sun?
Because the sun is so bright, you could just shoot it straight on. If you still want to use a sky tracker and you do a polar alignment, any movement in the sun, it'll keep it perfectly centered. But I've simulated photographing the sun and just tracking it by eye. In other words, when you go to take the image, you're going to be taking a shot that's at like 1/500th of a second. Even when you have a total eclipse, even if that shutter speed drops a little bit, you're still going to get enough of shutter speed where you're not going to get movement of the sun. I'm more worried about movement and vibration of your tripod, to be honest with you. But if you choose to go through the effort of using a sky tracker, it's certainly going to be better because that's one less thing you have to worry about. But I don't think it's really going to help in this case as much as if you were using a sky tracker to photograph, let's say, Jupiter and its moons.
Right. So Dale said, I think the question is about the sun moving and keeping the sun in your frame, moving your tripod, question mark?
Right, but what you do, you're going to be monitoring the sun in live view. And if it moves before you take that next shot, just recenter it. If you're using a sky tracker, you're absolutely right. Once you're locked on, it'll stay right in the center, right where you left it the whole time. But most photographers don't have a sky tracker, but that doesn't mean they're not. At the instant of photographing, wherever you have it composed in your viewfinder, well, in this case, the live viewfinder, you'll get the image that you want.
Here's a related one. Someone from Myrtle Beach, as an example, how would she know if it's total or something like 98%?
Well, what I would recommend you do, just so you could, because it is a little tricky, she's right. I would go online and look at some examples of total solar eclipse photographs. There's thousands of them online right now as people are getting ready for that. That's the look you're looking for. It's basically, yeah, let's see if we could, just give me a second. It's basically this. When you see this starburst that's occurring around the sun, and you know what, you're going to be able to sort of tell that you're not getting this burning, super bright sun, because when this happens, you'll be able to look at it without solar glasses or anything. It's just, you'll be able to glance at, we glance at the sun now with just sunglasses. We shouldn't stare at it, but everybody's seen the sun. It's too bright to look at. This won't be too bright to look at. But at the instant it starts to move again, you're going to start to see hot spots. You'll actually see little diamond hot spots forming. Once you notice one or two of those or three of those starting to form, put the filters back on.
And someone commented, a great website, timeanddate.com, gives the exact timing of the start, maximum, and end for any location or city in the USA. The website is timeanddate.com. So
that's excellent. That's excellent to share. Thank that person.
Thank you very much. That's from John Wilder. Sylvia wants to know, do these rules apply to a camera converted for IR?
I have not tried to photograph the sun with my IR camera, but the rules do apply. I just don't know what the results will look like. And you know what? If I get a chance this weekend, because I'm going camping with my wife, I'm going to try that with my IR camera, and I'll post it in my blog next week.
Very cool.
How does that sound? So that forces you to go to my website. Sorry, guys.
And then at totality, how do you get the base exposure from which to bracket? Is it similar to the bracket range with the solar filter in the partial phase?
Yeah, it's going to be exactly the same. Just take the first shot, take a quick look at the histogram, see if you have to increase the exposure a little bit to get it there. Chances are you're going to be somewhere around zeroed out on your metering at that point. Of course, at that point, you know, when you take the filters off, you could even look through your lens and look at it. I will, as long as you get your eye away from there when it starts to move again. So within that 2 to 3 minute range, you could sort of see what's happening.
Yeah. And then if shooting raw, is bracketing necessary? Is there any advantage?
Well, shooting in RAW allows you to do the post-processing much easier. If we shot that in JPEG, that post-process I showed you, you'd have to go into Photoshop and start adding color, and tell you the truth, I'd have to figure out how to do that. But I would stay in RAW. It allows you to do the post-processing. And bracketing in RAW, there's no problem with bracketing in RAW. It just gives you more data to play with. You could pick the best of the 3 or 4 images. Hey, listen, my D5 shoots at 12 frames a second. My D500 shoots at 10 frames a second. If I was going to bracket, it only takes a second to knock off 10 frames from, you know, -2 stops all the way up to +2 stops. I'll throw most of them away and pick out the 2 or 3 that really look good. So you could certainly do that with bracketing.
And then Ronald wants to know,
really shoot fast now.
Ronald wants to know, should I tape off my focus after I zone in on my focus?
That, if you could tape off your focus, that's probably a good idea, unless you're really careful and periodically check that you're at that infinity point. And I want to make one other quick point because we mentioned it and I didn't make the point. I don't know why I didn't make the point. This is just a safety point. If we go back to where I was showing here, my telescope setup, you see that? That's a lens wrap. If you use a telescope that has a viewfinder, either remove the viewfinder. Oh, here we go. I forgot to put it back in play. If you have a telescope that has a viewfinder, either take the viewfinder off or wrap it so that the sun isn't going through your viewfinder. It will melt your viewfinder because it's like putting a magnifying glass, in front of the sun and try to, burn holes and leaves. So make sure if your telescope has a viewfinder, cover it. And that's why I encourage you to even cover the viewfinder on your camera, even though you're in live view. Cover the viewfinder on your camera as a precaution so you don't have scattered light coming through there in the event you accidentally come out of live view for a second.
Right. And then a couple folks wanted to know about suggestions on how to filter large prime telephoto.
Repeat that question again, please.
Any suggestions on how to filter larger prime telephoto?
How to filter it? Are they talking about if they don't have a filter large enough for the front of their telephoto? For example, like a 600 f4, which is a huge front, 6-inch class element, 4-inch class element.
That was Don Hamilton. Don, if you want to expand on your question, I'll keep a lookout for it. In the meantime.
Well, let me just make this. If you have a big telephoto lens that has a drop-in filter, I believe Singh-Ray could make a replacement drop-in filter for that lens. I get a little leery about not having a filter in front of the lens when we're dealing with solar work. So that is a challenge.
And then the couple of people, I think you answered this, but do you still want the 1/500 seconds during totality?
I try to keep that shutter speed up, even if I have to increase the ISO. That shutter speed, the reason I want it up high if possible, that doesn't mean you won't get a good shot at slower shutter speeds. I just want to make sure I'm minimizing any chance of vibration through the tripod giving me a soft image. And a lot of people don't realize when you're dealing with high magnifications like 500 millimeters, or like this slide with a telescope that's at 2,000 millimeters, even people walking around you will, the vibration will render a softer image. So having a little higher shutter speed, I believe, will help minimize that.
Right. And then this is an interesting question. I had read elsewhere to expose every 12 minutes for multi-exposure composites, but you mentioned 20-minute intervals as your method. I only ask because I will be utilizing a few different cameras with my family in Medicine Bow National Forest in Wyoming, and having more time between shots would be helpful in helping the rest of my family work on their exposures.
That's actually an excellent point. 12-minute exposures is probably the ideal. 20-minute is something I'm going to try, which is going to be less shots, spaced far apart. That's just because of what I'm trying to do creatively with that. But if you want to get, sort of fill the frame with a shot like this. Let me find that shot. And then I showed this one, something like that. Then I recommend the 12-minute intervals, because that's what this is. This is simulated, but this is a 12-minute. This would simulate about a 12-minute interval between shots.
Right. So if someone is living in an area where they're not going to get a total eclipse at all, is it best to just leave the filter on the camera the whole time?
You have to leave the filter on at all times. If you're not going to get a total eclipse, even something like if you look at this little simulated shot, which is a bunch of shots, it's just stacked in Photoshop instead of a real multiple exposure. If you look, even that shot that's just to the left of the total eclipse, you could get away with not having a filter there, but the one just to the left of that, where the orange sun is showing again, that would damage your eyes. So if you're not going to get a total eclipse, keep the filter on at all times.
Okay. And then on my Canon 1-400 lens, the camera has an L-type mark before the infinity symbol. It does not allow me to put it in the middle of the infinity symbol. What should I do?
That's an excellent question. Some lenses don't have the ability to do that. So here's what I would do: is I would actually photograph something really far away that's out by infinity. You know, look at you should have readings on your lens that says when you're out to infinity, right before infinity, what that distance is. You know, it's usually X amount of feet. And then past there's infinity. Pick something far away, like a mountain, way off in a distance, and then put a little pencil mark at that infinity point on your lens, and then line it up there.
We had a couple of questions on focus too, actually. How do you suggest doing the focus? To aim at the sun or a point far, or point at a far object and then aim at the sun?
I would, if you're going to pre-focus to find your infinity point, I would find something far away. If your live view has the autofocus sensor, you could actually autofocus on the sun. You know, when you put your spot metering on the sun, you could autofocus on the sun, and then at that point, switch your lens or your camera to manual focus so it stays there. Sort of take a note. You could do that before the eclipse. The sun isn't going to change that much in distance. You could go out tomorrow, autofocus on the sun through live view with your filters in place. And then wherever you get a sharp exposure, put a little pencil mark or a piece of tape on your lens and put a little pencil mark so that you could pre-line it up when you're getting ready for the eclipse. Because that point isn't going to change 2 weeks from now when the eclipse happens.
Yeah. Will they be able to focus on the moon to get the camera infinity spot?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's how I check my infinity points on my lenses that I'm going to use, that I knew that they were truly at infinity. I went out the other night and photographed the moon.
Right. And a couple of folks are asking questions about wide angle. Someone is going to be in Yellowstone. Does she need or does he need a wide angle?
It depends on the view you want to get. You know, hey, if you could go over to Old Faithful and then it happens to be going off when the eclipse is happening, more power to you. Getting something in the foreground because you want a wider angle shot doesn't hurt, but this is going to be, even out in Wyoming, this is going to be pretty high in the sky. It's going to be really tough to get foreground in this.
Yep.
You know, but yeah, wider angle shot, just make sure you're exposing for the sun if you want the detail of the sun.
And this is an interesting one too. With a wide angle multi-exposure, would you suggest taking one shot of the foreground, if available, from your shooting location to later blend with your sun multi-exposures? Can that render a good image? And they sign that Photoshop newbie.
I had mentioned that actually before. That is a good way to do it. If you could get this to occur and still get foreground, either before or after the eclipse, take a normal photograph of the scene and save that image without changing the focal length of your camera or its position. Well, you could change it because you could actually do a composite in Photoshop and layers, but you could blend those together and then do a tone mapping, either tone mapping in like Nik software or layers in Photoshop to create a composite photograph, such as this photograph. This is a composite photograph.
Okay, I'm answering another question here. Will the video be available online to share with your friends? And it will be on the Singh-Ray website. There's a list of all of the future webinars. This one is going to be moved down to past webinars, but the link will still be there, and you can still register for it even after it happens, which means if you find this helpful, you send your friend there, they can register, and they'll get a link to the video right away, which is very, very cool. So if you know someone that would benefit from watching this, go ahead, and you do have to register to be able to view it, but it will be there. Another interesting question: do smartphones and point at shoots need filters?
Yes. Yep, just because they're nothing more than live view cameras. So you could actually, if you're clever enough, if you have, an iPhone or a point and shoot camera, you could get a 15 stop filter, rectangular filter, and rig it somehow to just be in front, right up against the lens of your smartphone, and it should work just fine. Now, that being said, I haven't tried it.
Right. So like the 300 2.8?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The 300 2.8 has a drop-in filter in the back. I don't know if they're using a Nikon, Canon, or Sony, but it has a drop-in filter in the back, and which is typically like 52 millimeters. So you could get a 52 millimeter 15 stop. Here's where you have to be careful. And if you're using live view, it's not a problem. You have to be careful that if you scratch that filter, you're going to have gleaming light hitting your sensor. And you'll know right away. So you know what? I test my filters by taking a quick look. And if I see something that looks too hot, I turn the camera. Because a quick second isn't going to damage your filter. I look at that live view, point it at the sun, and if it looks like there's a scratch in the filter and some light's coming through, or shine a flashlight on your filter and make sure there's no scratches on it before you do that drop-in filter. Because it's right up against, unlike the filter in front of the lens, it's at the rear of the lens, and it's right up close to the sensor.
Right. And how do you get a Nikon to shoot burst while bracketing?
To actually shoot burst while bracketing, put it in continuous, up on top of the Nikon on the left-hand side, most of them. You could have it in single, continuous low, continuous high. That's not the autofocus, that's continuous firing. So when I have it in bracketing, let's say I pick 9 bracketed spots at a stop apart. So I'm set. I actually hold the shutter down with cable release. I hold it down. It'll fire all 9 shots. When it gets to the end, the camera will stop. It'll be looking for a reset. And then you release the shutter and resets. Just remember to turn your bracketing off when you're done with all this. I once had a wedding photographer call me up who was one of my students in Wildlife and Nature, and he's in the middle of the wedding, and he said, only one image is coming out right, the other 9 aren't. And I've made this mistake. It wasn't just him. He had done some bracketing the day before and forgot to turn his bracketing off. So he had to, every time he shot, even one at a time, it bracketed, +1, +2, +3, -1, -2, -3. So just remember that whenever you do something special in your camera, I call it, if you were in one of my classes, putting it back, I call mine putting it back to Vinny's normal setup. So whenever I do any type of photo shoot, if I do anything that's different than my norm, I make sure before I leave that photo shoot, everything is set back to Vinny's normal setup. So if I pick my camera up tomorrow, I know where it's going to be. So.
Right. So fun comment. Jeff says, thank you. This is a great webinar, and I'm sorry I use Lee filters.
That's okay. They make a fine filter, just maybe not quite as good.
Yeah, next time you go to buy one, think of us. Joe,
hey, listen, tell him he's listening. You could always eBay your Lee filters and buy some Singh-Rays.
Right. So Joe said, I like to shoot waterfalls, and I was thinking of an ND filter. What do you recommend for that? I'm thinking about a 10 and a 5 or a 15 and a 5 and having more options in the future.
Okay. The 15 works really well with slow-moving streams and lakes and waterfalls. It's probably a bit much for the waterfall itself. The 5 is like near perfect. I use between 3 and 5 stops for moving water and waterfalls. So, the 5 will, you could use for waterfalls. The 15, lakes, slow-moving streams. Great filter for that. It's my #1 filter. It looks like you have stagnant water when you're done. In the morning when it's a little bit misty, it creates more mist look. You're shooting waves at the beach. I've used a 15 stop filter to shoot waves hitting against the jetty, and it was like I was in this magical, mystical wonderland. In fact, I think that I have that up on my blog. If you go to my blog,
Some of those photos look like you're on another planet.
Yeah, it's just really great stuff. So the 15 stop, I like, I have 3 Mor-Slos. I have a 5 stop, a 10 stop, and a 15 stop. They control a lot of light and creativity.
Yeah. And then someone said they read that you cannot use a drop-in filter at the back of a lens because it will magnify light and burn the filter.
Yeah, that's why I said I don't know. That's why I'm reluctant to, but that's the only place on a 300 or bigger that you can put a filter. I don't know. I don't know, and even the technical people I talked to at the various camera manufacturers weren't 100% sure. So my recommendation is to be very careful if you decide to do that.
Right. And then Joe says, this is the best webinar ever, 3 exclamation marks. I wish I could shoot with you live.
Well, you know what? I run workshops all over the country, and I carry my Singh-Ray filters. So, and we always carry Singh-Ray filters to loan out. So take a look at the website. I haven't put my 2018 schedule up yet, but that'll be going up next week.
So Dale wants to know how to find your blog. Can they just Google it? Do you want to give your web address and your blog again?
If you go to my website, which is Escape, here, we'll make it easy. Let me just get down here. This will just take a second. Yeah. You go to that website, and you'll see a tab that says blog. That's the easiest way to get to it. By the way, if you didn't want to type all that, you could go to vinnycolucci.com and redirects to escape-to-naturephotography.com.
So is there any benefit to in-camera HDR shots of the Eclipse?
Never tried it. I've never tried it, so I'd be misleading you if I took a guess. So your experimentation is just as experimental as if I went out and tried to experiment with it.
Right. Now, what about using a split ND filter for landscape, assuming you can get the sun with a very wide angle?
Well, again, if you do that, you could use a split ND filter, but you need to stack enough to get up to at least 15 stops. I don't know if Singh-Ray would custom build a 15 stop ND filter for you, but you could certainly get, and you got to be careful about the thickness then, because you'd be stacking 4 or 5 filters to get to 15 stops. Again, looking at that sun, it's going to be bright. It's going to be bright. And again, it depends how big the sun is in your viewfinder. We've all photographed the sun with an ND filter and had just a white spot up there.
At 1/500th of a second shutter speed, I assume I turn off VR, right?
Great question. If you're on a tripod, and I tell people this all the time, if I'm shooting loose, like for wildlife, like on that gimbal head that we talked about, like this type of gimbal head, where'd it go? If I'm shooting loose on a gimbal head, like that upper right-hand corner, I leave the VR on. But if I'm clamping anything down, like I'm going to do for the solar eclipse, the VR has to be off. And here's why. The VR or the image stabilization in the Canon and the Sony type systems and others, they're looking for vibration. And if you clamp down solid and there's no movement at all, it'll hunt. And you know when it'll hunt? At the best shot. Most of the shots will come out fine, but the one that you really wanted, that's the one that's going to be a little blurry because the electronics and the computer and the lens said, oh, let's take a look and see where there's some vibration. So I recommend you turn the VR off, clamp down for the solar eclipse.
Okay, so we're whittling down to the last couple of questions. Can you use the interval setting for my shutter to take pictures every couple of seconds or every couple of minutes?
Yeah, you could set it up, and the optimum is 12-minute spans for during the eclipse. Right. Just go to the time that the eclipse is supposed to happen, back up a series of 12 minutes to start it, so you can get all those in. I'm going to try a couple at 20-minute interviews because I'm trying something where the spacing's a little bit wider. That's just what Vinny's doing. But yeah, they've been talking about 12 minutes to 14 minutes being like the optimum for doing that.
And Peter added a tip. If you're high in the sky pointing up, it might mean zoom creep on cheaper lenses. Do you agree with that?
Excellent point. A lot of the less expensive lenses do creep especially if it's a push-pull lens. And then what I recommend you do is bring some, some painter's tape, because that doesn't leave residue, and tape your lens in position.
Okay. Whoa, they're moving on me. Okay, I have the Singh-Ray warming polarizer, but I don't own any ND filters. Will the polarizer work and be safe?
No.
Okay.
That's a simple question. It doesn't. A polarizer has depends on which one you have. The warming one only is about a 2-stop filter, fully polarized, and the standard one is about a 3-stop filter, fully polarized. You need to get to 15 stops.
Right. And then, I don't know if this is a follow-up to something else, but Arnold said, shouldn't using the EVF on a mirrorless be okay?
Say that again.
Shouldn't using the EVF on a mirrorless be okay? I think he's asking if it's safe for the eyes if he's using the electronic view without, yeah.
Yes, because the electronic viewfinder is nothing more than than a live view at less quality.
Right.
But make sure those filters are in front of the lens before you point it at the sun.
Right. And if I have a very ND filter, should I purchase a thin ring or a standard ring Mor-Slo?
If you're going to use if you're going to use the ND filter, and I'm assuming they're saying that they have rings on the front, the standard ring Mor-Slo would allow you to screw something on it. The thin filter ring doesn't have threads, and you'd have to hold the filter for a long period of time in front. So as long as you have threads, I would use the standard, because you're going to be fairly telephoto, unless you're doing a wide angle shot. And then you're going to obviously want to be careful not to pick up vignetting due to stacking. And again, you can test all of this before the Eclipse outside.
Right. So Jeff, I think, is looking for a cheat sheet. He says it's going to be hectic during the totality. What are the approximate camera settings you recommend?
400 to 500 ISO, f8 at somewhere around 1/400th of a second.
Okay. That's that. And any suggestions? I think you covered this. Any suggestions on how to attach or filter large telephoto lens prime?
Yeah, one of the prime, and somebody brought up a good point that if you did your rear filter, it might be still too magnified and you might damage your sensor. They don't make a filter big enough for a 300-2.8 on up. They just don't make a filter big enough for that. That's safe. And there is one other direction, is possibly getting a telescope filter and then jury rigging it in front.
Right.
But again, that's a dedicated filter and it could only be used for the Eclipse.
Right. With a full frame camera, would you shoot in FX or DX mode?
Well, if I had a full frame camera, and I would shoot in the FX mode, because if you shoot in the DX mode, that's nothing more than cropping, and I'd rather crop in post-processing.
Okay, and then this one looks familiar. Full frame camera or crop camera, which should I use? I have the Canon 7D Mark II. Is that suitable? I like the reach of the crop camera.
The crop camera, depending on which lens selection you pick, I have a D5 and a D500. D5 full frame, D500 cropped. I'm using on my 200 to 500 the D500, so I don't have to use a teleconverter on the lens. Teleconverter introduces some softness, so I would recommend a crop camera.
Okay, and then after setting your lens for infinity, how do you focus for infinity?
When you set it for infinity, that's it. It's focused for infinity.
Okay, we're getting down to the last 10 questions. Dale added that there's an app called Solar Eclipse Timer that talks to you based on where you are and tells you the times, which is handy because then you don't have to take your face away from your photos. So that's Solar Eclipse Timer. It looks like Solar Eclipse is one word and timer is a second word. So that's an app that will talk out loud to you while you're out there.
Well, I will look into that myself.
That looks very cool. And then Bruce said he uses photo pills. It's been upgraded to show where the sun will be and the path of totality using AF augmented reality. You can see where the sun will be from your location. So that's called photo pills. It's one word, photo and then pills, Pills. So that's another good tip there. And then there's another tip was to look at the website mreclipse.com. And then also NASA has a special page for it as well. So there's information there. Those are all really good tips. What setting on the Nikon release mode dial?
What setting on the Nikon?
Release mode dial.
I leave mine on continuous shooting so I could shoot in bursts, whether I'm bracketing or not. That's just my style. But you could put it on single and just take one shot at a time if you like. In the release mode for a single. Depending on which Nikon model you have, you could either get to that external controls. A lot of them are a little push button that you could either go to single, continuous low, continuous high.
Right. And then Carlin added a comment about the long prime lens. He said Canon doesn't recommend the drop-in filter on the long prime lens for the Eclipse on their website. So I guess they've officially said they don't recommend it. But then he says he's used Singh-Ray filters for years. They're the best in the biz. Great presentation, and thanks. So thank you, Harlan, for your information and adding to the conversation. That's good. Dale says, Michelle and Vinny, you guys are wonderful. I love you so much. I'm a dedicated Singh-Ray user. Love them. We love you back. And then do I need to refocus every time the sun moves and have to move the camera?
No. As long as you're on that infinity mark. The sun is so far away that as long as you're on that infinity mark, you're good. And if you're shooting at f8 to f11, that little bit of depth of field is, going to pick up, help you with any error. Again, going out and pre-practicing on the moon or something really far away to make sure you know where that infinity mark really is on your lens is not a bad thing before this event occurs.
So fun tip, and I suppose this would work. You can tape a pair of Eclipse glasses to your phone. I guess if you wanted to filter your phone for the Eclipse.
That's an excellent idea, but let me caution you one thing. Most of the Eclipse glasses are very flexible, so make sure that the filter element is super flat against your camera lens element on the back of your phone, because if it bends, it's going to have distortion, and so what looks like you're getting a sharp image, when you're done with it, won't be sharp because of diffraction through a bent element.
Right. And then during totality, I heard you say that the exposure should be about one stop difference before and after totality. Should we just change ISO? Trying to find something that is easy to do.
I would, changing ISO doesn't change exposure necessarily, but if you're in manual, it certainly would. You could go up higher in ISO, which which will bring in more light. You could try that, but again, I would practice that. I have a tendency to rather change the shutter speed in manual. So if I want to increase the stoppage, I will slow down my shutter speed just a little bit, and you may have to up your ISO to keep that 1/500th of a second. It's just, you might have to. It's sort of like a chef adding a whole bunch of ingredients to his pot. Sometimes it's a blend of all three: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to get you there.
Right.
And again, we're really lucky that we could practice all this before time.
Yeah, I think practice is key, especially, a lot of times you can't capture things at the moment you want to, and we get to practice with the full-blown strength of the sun beforehand, so that's handy. We still have 100 people on the line, which is really, really good. I'm glad you guys stuck around, and I'm glad you're asking all these questions. We are coming to the end here. Eric wants to know, did I hear correctly that VR should only be necessary with the gimbal style head?
No, that would be. I like to use a gimbal head for wildlife. If I'm shooting loose, even if I'm on a ball head, if I'm shooting loose where I'm tracking something, I leave my VR on. But if I clamp down for a landscape, or in the case of this, the solar eclipse, I turn the VR off. It doesn't matter what head you're on.
That's a good one. Dale said, except we can't practice the totality of the eclipse, so that's the problem with the exposure during it.
Yeah,
There's a
that's
way to
true.
practice that by putting something in front of the lens.
You know what? If you could cut a nice little circle and put it in front of the lens, that's actually might be a neat trick to try. I would still be careful. Don't look through the viewfinder if you're taking the filters off to do that. And you know, because it isn't the same. It isn't the same as the moon blocking. Because if you make a mistake and your little cutout is too small, you may damage your sensor. So I'm a little worried about telling you to try that, but you know, that's up to you.
Right. Another tip on the website, if you go to eclipse2017.nasa.gov/eclipse-101, this is in the Q&A window, which I believe you guys can see. That's another website you can go to for information directly from NASA, and those are the guys in the know. Let me make sure I haven't missed anything in the chat window. It looks like that's all in the questions window. I think we've gotten through all of these. So multiple questions about the recording. If you're in the webinar right now, you are for sure registered, and tomorrow you'll get a link to the recorded session. So you can go back and listen to this and fast forward to the parts that are most interesting, and really prepare before you get out there with your camera. Definitely, if you found this helpful, come to the Singh-Ray website. It's Singh, SINGH-Ray, RAY.com. If you go to singray.com/webinars, you'll see all of our upcoming webinars. We're going to be doing, focusing on different filters, but also on different subjects. We're going to talk about fall colors. We're going to talk about black and white when the snow comes. We've got a couple of different topics coming up that are going to be really seasonally relevant, and we really hope that you'll join us for that. We are, just like we did today, we're going to talk about a lot more than just the filter, and we want these to be helpful and educational for you. It's, you know, obviously we hope you'll buy a filter, but the primary goal with these webinars is to educate and not necessarily to sell you things that you may or may not use. And we've got Marie Noel was listening on the train on her way to work in Melbourne, Australia. So we've got people on the line from everywhere. So it looks like all the questions are answered. Bruce has your hand up. So Bruce, if you have a question, start typing it in there now. But we've been on for a long time, and I'm so excited that you guys spent all of this time with us today, because your time is valuable. So we're very flattered that you guys chose to be with us. And Vinny, I am so glad that you were here to lead the webinar for us, and that you have all of this experience that we can use.
Well, again, thank you, Michelle, thanks Singh-Ray, and all the participants. It's an honor to maybe be a little bit of a benefit, and I hope everybody gets that National Geographic cover shot.
Yep. If anyone has any questions after the webinar, you can go to the website. You can call us on the 800 number. We are based in Florida, so we're on Eastern time. We are very responsive, though, by email and also by phone. We're a very responsive team of real people who really want to talk to you. So if you have questions about the Singh-Ray filters, if you want to find out how to get a hold of Vinny, he gave you his website. If you have any questions for him, let our team know at Singh-Ray, and we're happy to put you guys in touch with each other. So again, it's singh-ray.com is the website, and all of our contact information is there. And we're just so flattered that you guys spent this time with us today. So thank you, Vinny, and get out there and have a break. It sounds like you've worked hard this week.
Well, thank you again. Thank all of you, and everybody have a blessed evening.
All right. Thank you.
Good night.